Welcome, Paul.
Yes, good afternoon. My theme is Israel's part in the salvation of Christianity. The theme of this conference is, why is the world pretending not to notice the imminent liquidation of the Christian people of the Arab world? I believe that we will find a valuable analogy in the 1930s, when people, governments and civilians, were making the most determined effort not to notice that the Jews of Europe were facing imminent genocide. This continued until began the actual liquidation by the millions. The lesson we find in that story is that people who called themselves Christians, and by this definition Germany was one of the most Christian nations of the time, certainly one of the most church-going, were in their heart of hearts, and despite noises to the contrary that they made in the best circles, more than content to contemplate a world without Jews. Similarly, there are people today, some of them belonging to the elites who preside over education, the professions, the leaders of opinion, editors of newspapers, many in the leadership of churches who in their heart of hearts are more than content and quietly eager to see a world without Christians. Another analogy in the 1930s I find in the circumstance that nominally Christian people who move in circles of prestige and influence make a determined practice of avoiding reference to their Christian faith, and above all, of covering any traces that they belong to churches, or that they accept the truths that the church has always taught. This is analogous to the widespread practice among German Christians of avoiding contact with Jews, lest such contact cause suspicion of friendship with Jews. I have a proposition to offer to you. If Christianity survives in the Middle East, it will not be because of any interest taken for its cause by the Christians in our part of the world, but rather because the state and the people of Israel and conscientious Jews elsewhere are dedicated to serving it. Israel is the only polity in the entire Middle East in which Christian numbers are increasing. Throughout the Middle East, Christian populations have been declining steadily and dramatically for over a century. Of the handful of Christian communities still extant at the beginning of this century, most of these have been moved out of intensive care and are now on their deathbeds. Since the beginning of the Arab Spring, an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the Christian population of Iraq, for example, has been displaced from cities and towns where they have lived for centuries. The numbers are similar for Syria. In Egypt, 100,000 have already left since the so-called Arab Spring began. As for the Middle East, here is the bottom line. In 1900, Christians made up 13% of the population of the Middle East. Today, it is variously estimated at 1 to 3%, and falling rapidly. Until the last few years, two main factors accounted for the falling population. One was emigration, the other was the declining rate of birth. Today, however, the major factor is overt liquidation of Christians by their neighbors. We all believe in miracles, of course, but speaking strictly in natural terms, it is not probable that Christianity can survive beyond the next decade or two in the Middle East. This story is a replay of the story of the expulsion of the Jews from the Middle East. A story that began in its final chapter in 1948, 1949, in the wake of the Israeli War of Independence, when the Arab peoples turned against their governments and blamed them for harboring Jews in their midst, and those governments drove out the Jewish population. It took about 4 or 5 years until the very last of those Jews was out of the Middle East. Jews are now entirely absent from the Arab world, as you know. Now, as this other theme is playing out, which I see as a mirror of the earlier theme, the imminent liquidation of the Christians, there's a powerful irony in the fact that the last hope for Christians in the Middle East is in Israel. Israel is the only polity in the Middle East in which the absolute number of Christians is growing. This is mainly on account of the flight of Arab Christians from the Palestine Authority and from the rest of the Arab world, but also, less well known but very important, the flight of African Christians from persecution and terrorism, from Ethiopia, Somalia, and so on, all of whom are taking up refuge in Israel. And in 1948, at the time of the creation of the State of Israel, Christians were 2.9% of the population. Today, they are a somewhat larger proportion of the whole population, as their absolute numbers have grown heroically, almost in tandem with the heroic growth of the numbers of Israeli Jews. Perhaps the largest irony attaching to this story of the imminent liquidation of the Christians of that part of the world is that if Christianity survives, it will not be because of any interest taken by Christians in our part of the world, but rather because the state of Israel and the people of Israel and conscientious Jews everywhere are dedicated to saving it. Here is a very interesting example of, shall we say, lay Judaism coming to the rescue of Christianity. Do you know the name George Lord Wiedenfeld, a distinguished peer of Great Britain, a distinguished publisher? If you'll take the trouble to go home and look in your library, you probably got a few books published by his publications. He was a penniless 5-year-old in Austria when British Quakers and other Christians fed and clothed him and helped him reach the UK from Vienna after Hitler seized Austria in 1938. Before he died, just a few months ago, at the age of 95 in January 2016, Lord Wiedenfeld told the Daily Mail that for all these years he had felt that he owed a debt to these particular Christian people for what they had done for him, and that he had at last found the way to repay that debt. The way he has done it was through the establishment of something called the Wiedenfeld Safe Havens Fund. It is a project to rescue 2,000 Christians from the ISIS terrorists in Syria. Another example of what I would call lay Judaism's concern for Christianity is the example of the Simon Wiesenthal organization. We had hoped to have Rabbi Abraham Cooper here today, but you are familiar of his work. He and Rabbi Yitzhak Adlerstein recently issued a statement. We have been warning Western governments for months that a religious genocide of Christians was taking place. Much more needs to be done. First, the U.S. administration, the administration of the American government, should recognize the centrality of religious extremism in ISIS's terrorist activities and publicly acknowledge that theologically fueled hatred is at the heart of this conflict. Recently, the same pair, Adlerstein and Cooper, have been working to get our political leaders to acknowledge that the major factor preventing the resolution of the complaints of the Arab Palestinians is that the Palestine Authority is not devoted to the two-state solution as it pretends. But that their ambitions to create a Muslim state, which would be governed under Muslim law, in which, as Abbas has candidly expressed, no Jew would be allowed to live. And Christians, if they're allowed to live at all, would be under the circumstances written out by Muhammad in the Quran. Cooper says, we know of the increasing frequency of neighbors in Bethlehem jeering at the shrunken Christian population, calling upon them to convert to Islam. Throughout the Middle East, some of the oldest Christian communities in the world have already been decimated in the Assyrian Triangle of Iraq, and you've just been educated a bit in that if you weren't familiar with what that was. All of this stands in striking contrast, the concern of Jews for Christianity, to the dominant anti-Zionism within the churches themselves. I think a more profound piece of work is going on in the world. It is going on at the ideological level, and it is the effort to get Christianity removed from its place in the public arena, and to get expressions of Christian belonging declared illegal. I know a gal who teaches law at Carleton University who told me once that there is an active movement within the legal circus in Canada to have Christianity declared a conspiracy against humanity. There's a group that's actually dedicated to this. Recently, we've seen an expression of this attitude at the United States. A few weeks ago, a propaganda challenge was thrown down to the Christian world from UNESCO, the United Nations Economic, Scientific, Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, whose motto states that political and economic agreements are not enough to build a lasting peace. Peace must be established on the basis of humanity's moral and intellectual authority. Who could quarrel with that? That was their founding statement. Over the past few days, in pursuit of this mandate, UNESCO has ground out several resolutions, you're probably aware of this, condemning Israel for aggressions in Jerusalem and elsewhere for its illegal measures against the freedom of worship of Muslims. In order to provide pseudo-scholarly foundations for this, they have been conducting a campaign to get the world to accept that there had never been a temple, there had never been a Jewish presence in what we now call Israel. It's utterly insane, but you can get this by going to their website. Now, in order to accomplish this, they have been cranking out resolutions at the UN declaring that Israel has no right to be where it is, that everything that belongs to Israel actually belongs to Islam. But recently they took a very bold tangent in another direction by basing their claim upon their assertion that there never was a temple, there never was a Jewish presence. Now, not incidentally, but very, very deliberately, this means that the Gospels upon which Christian faith are based are a fraud. Because the Gospels speak of Jesus as a Jew, it speaks of his disciples as Jew, it describes the temple, it describes people going and coming from the temple. If there was no temple, if the Jewish people never lived in that area, they certainly weren't there when the Gospels were written. Christianity bases its claim upon very stark and maybe you might even think merciless historical claims. But they're categorically historical. They cannot be reduced or watered down into some other kind of claim. The story of the life and the death and the resurrection of a man in a certain time and a certain place. Now all of this is lost if the Gospels can be paraded as false documents. There never was a temple, ergo Jesus did not walk in the temple. The disciples did not follow him. Very few people have noticed this, the impact of the UNESCO Declaration upon Christian faith. Very few people have noticed it. It is yet another insult to Jewish faith and Jewish belief and Jewish belonging. But now it's taken a further step by frontally assaulting the basis of the claims of Christianity as well. And it strikes me that the only two people I can find who actually directly address this phenomenon are Jews. One is Shimon Fogel, who many of you will know, who wrote an article recently published in the National Post in which he states, in attempting to rebrand the Temple Mount and Western Wall as exclusively Islamic sites, the UNESCO resolution has negated the history of Christianity. The Christian Gospels explicitly record how Jesus, a practicing Jew, preached to synagogues and visited the temples in Jerusalem. To deny the presence of a temple, a matter confirmed by independent scholarship, is to tell Christians that their Bible is false history. No Christian theologian that I know of has stepped up to make this their claim. They just don't seem to notice. Well, their minds are on other things, and I simply have not noticed it. my mind has been turning lately to the book of Jonah. And not only my mind, but the mind of our previous speaker. And I'm struck by, as I reread the book of Jonah, how closely related has been the destiny of the Jews and the destiny of the Assyrian Christians of that part of the world. Go to the book of Jonah and have another good hard look at it. Here's a gal named Luma Sims, who grew up in Loftus, Iraq, and who reflects on world affairs for Catholic journals. And she says in a recent journal, anyone who claims that the Arab world, Muslim and Christian, is not pathologically anti-Semitic is delusional. This is the elephant in the room in the Arab Christian subculture. The secret sin no one wants to bring to light. Israel is the last hope for Arab Christians. It's as simple as that, she says. Let it always be said, here's the part I like, and I bring to you today, and I'm going to close on this. It could very well be a motto for what we're doing today. Let it always be said that in the dark age of ISIS, when desolation and despair covered the Arab world, Israel was the house of light. Like the prophet Jonah, whom God commanded to go to Nineveh and offer redemption to the Assyrians, may Israel go and redeem Assyria, redeem the Nineveh plains once again. Amen.